Hi, I'm Luke Hanson McDonald, and this is my podcast about family business. So today's guest is Akash Shah. He's the former CEO and owner of Vivify Specialty Ingredients. They're a manufacturer and distributor of dyes, pigments, and colorants based in Chicago, Illinois. So today you're going to learn how Akash Shah's father convinced both Akash and his younger brother to join the family business while he was struggling. You're also going to learn how Akash crafted a new path for the business that led to 20 years of unprecedented growth. And lastly, you're going to learn how Akash found the right private equity partner to buy out his brother and father and allow him to grow the business before ultimately selling the business to another private equity group. And if you stick around to the end, you're going to learn how Akash is reinvesting his proceeds through his family office. You're not going to want to miss this one. This is Beyond the Family Business podcast. Let's jump into it. Who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do?
Hi, Luke. Great to be on. Thanks for having me. Akash Shah, based out of Chicago, Illinois, born and raised. So far, still proud to be a Chicagoan, although the city of Miami has been calling my name for a long time. My business was a specialty chemicals business, and so said simply, we were in the value-added distribution business. So we would bring in colorants for cosmetics, food ingredients. So you think about what goes on makeup, what goes in those fancy color food you might buy from your consumer products at the grocery store, and also colors that were used for industrial purposes, like your automotive bumpers, car paint, as well as the architectural paint you might have on your walls at home. And so we were involved initially in distribution and then got involved in manufacturing in the United States. I ran that business from 2003 to 2021, and then ultimately sold the business to their private equity.
So very excited to get into this story. It's a very interesting story where there's an awesome founder, story. And then there's also the next generation taking it to the next level, private equity's involved. So very unique. And as I said to you before, this is the first time I've interviewed somebody who has a business case study written about their family business. So I'll share that in the description as well, because it's a very fascinating read. First of all, what is the name of your family business?
So the family business, when it was founded in 1979 by my parents, specifically my father, was called Akash Chemicals. And so, as for those of you paying attention, that's also my first name. And so, it's a typical maybe cultural thing. My parents were immigrants from India who moved to the United States in the mid 60s. And so in kind of that, along with the Indian culture, they decided to name their first business after their first child, which was me. And so, you fast forward when you become to the age of joining the family business or not, and you have a company named after you, no pressure. Maybe it's something you should consider. But fast forward that business, Akash Chemicals, as we grew it and scaled it, around the time of sale, just for the longevity and kind of future of the business, was rebranded and now operates as Vivify Specialty Ingredients.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And Akash Chemical was also ACDI. Is that that was sort of the acronym for it? Okay. Very cool. And where in India was your
My
parents
parents are
from?
based from a place called Gujarat, so Ahmedabad, which is kind of the western part of India. But again, they've been here since the mid 60s. So, for them now, the US has been home for much longer than India was.
Yeah, for sure. I've actually had two guests, one who was born in Gujarat and another one whose family originally was from Gujarat. So very entrepreneurial part of India, obviously. Starting off, could you share a bit more about that, founder story, about your parents and how they ended up starting this business?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost cliche because you hear this probably from a lot of immigrants, but my parents literally came to the United States. Actually, they met in the United States. They came for education. So separately, right? Because they met in college. But they came with, that typical immigrant, $0 in your pocket, right? Had a family member that they kind of stayed with and really focused on education and hard work, and really kind of came up from nothing from that perspective. My father is a chemical engineer and then also an MBA. And so shortly after finishing his MBA in Chicago, he went to work for a typical kind of chemical engineering chemical plant operations company. and really didn't like the job. And he kind of had this vision that he can do more than this. He's been given the opportunity as an immigrant that his other siblings that were back in India did not get. So he was already feeling like, hey, I'm the lucky one. I made it to the US and I want to create something on my own. So he pretty quickly came up with this idea that, he knew some family members in India that were producing this indigo blue dye. So it's a colorant that was going on blue jeans, right? So imagine, denim jeans back in the day, and these were all being made in the United States. So as a chemical engineer, he said, look, I'm going to import these denim colors or indigo dye from India, and I'm going to sell it to manufacturers in the US that dye jeans. And that was really the idea. And so without getting too much in the nitty-gritty, right? Because businesses, there's always some behind the scenes stuff going on. He was able to work with some people in India that said, look, I'm going to open up a market for you in the US. And then he went to customers and said, look, I can get you some high quality, lower cost um, colorants from India for your products. And those products were, you know, all kinds of textile garments, shirts, pants, towels, right? Anything that you can think of that had colors, drapery that had colors in it and that were all being dyed in the US. And so his business, really took off pretty quickly because he was one of the first real importers in that industry. And he backed it up with, the initial supply chain terms that we use today, we take for granted today, but just in time inventory and quality assurance because he built his own labs in Chicago to test the quality of what was coming over before he supplied it to his customers. And so while we all might think those are kind of, easy to do things in today's world, he was doing this in the late 70s.
Oh, very cool. And so was that in the Chicago area where he was based? Okay, very cool. And at that time, just relative size of the business, was it just a few people or how quickly did it grow in those initial
Yeah,
years?
I think, again, being an immigrant mentality, he didn't have like what we have today where you have a startup and you're going to have go out and raise funding and you're going to have, 5 to 7 people. I mean, this was very much bootstrapped. He borrowed a couple dollars from a couple friends to like buy inventory and then eventually got like an initial small bank loan to buy inventory for his products. But it was just him and basically an admin, right? That was helping him, manage sending kind of correspondence back and forth between customers and suppliers. But it was a very bootstrapped small organization for several years. I mean, he only had himself and his admin for the first 5 years of his business. And for the first 5 years, he was just essentially buying and selling with this kind of testing concept, which got introduced in the kind of the second half of that 5 year period. And then when he had established enough business, say about $5 million in revenue, is when he started investing in his own warehouse, his own labs, and his own people. But even then, because he was only really in the purely distribution business, he really only had about 15 people kind of at the largest point of his business as he was running it independently before the next generation got involved.
And so how old were you when you started the business?
He started the business essentially when I was born, and hence he got the
When you were
name,
born?
the
Oh,
name at the
wow.
this two birds with one stone, right? Akash Chemicals and Akash Shah. There we are. Yeah.
Are you, are you sure you weren't named after the
Yeah.
business? You never know which one came
It's a
first.
question we get often,
Um,
and so, I don't know. Well, I guess just use
uh,
your imagination, so.
yeah. Oh, very cool. And so your dad was obviously quite progressive because when you were still relatively young, he gifted you and your brother a meaningful stake in the business. Can you speak a little bit about that?
For sure, I think it's, to this day, probably one of the biggest, the smartest moves I think he made from a wealth generation and next generation planning standpoint, because his grandkids and other will benefit from this as well, and just kind of how we've structured things. But I think I don't know what triggered it for him for sure, but he did have a couple of very close friends that were close to him kind of passed at an earlier age, and I think he had this realization that I have this business now, and if something were to happen to me, my kids might be hit with this estate tax, my kids and maybe wife or whatever, depending on how the structure is. And so he just thought early about gifting, almost from a kind of trust planning, right? Next generation planning type of thing. And so um, keep in mind at that point, the company, you know, evaluations were different then. I mean, it was there was a lot of money required to keep inventory, so there's a lot of cash kind of held in the business. As a traditional family business, maybe some of, let's say, expenses are, for tax purposes, not always tracked, let's say, in the most professional manner. And so it was really hard to know what the business was worth. So I don't think at that time he necessarily thought he was giving away that much. And that was, of course, 15% each to my brother and I, which was, of course, significant if you think about that today. Um, but it was something that, again, because it was a minority stake in the business, he was able to gift it at a low valuation, because there's no
Mm-hmm.
control of those shares. And I think I don't. I mean, I think it was just more of a, like, a gut feel. Hey, what feels like the right amount? Again, I don't think at that
Mm.
point, he had brought in a ton of advisors or anything like that really helped him calculate how this is going to work out and what this could be worth long term. It was a more of a in the moment decision and kind of how he was feeling at that time frame in his life.
Mm. I mean, to me, it speaks to how much he values family. It's I've seen a lot of family businesses, and it's very rare that the patriarch voluntarily starts to give up, equity in the business, no matter what size it is, to the next generation, that early on. So, yeah, he must be a very generous and family forward person.
Yeah, 100%. And we talk often, as Luke, about family values and how do you kind of pass that to the next generation. We have a business, right? And that's one thing. You can pass a business, you can pass wealth. How do you pass values? And that's something, if you think
Mm.
about it, this is kind of a education 101 on values, because he basically what he taught us is family is important, as you said. And then my brother and I have kind of carried that forward. And so now as we think about how we pass on our wealth, we've done a lot of gifting early as well. And I think that's just because that's part of our family culture and how we watched our dad do it for us.
That's incredible. So, while very generous from your dad's point of view, you were in high school at the time, were you not? So a huge amount of accountability, beginning that gifting process so early. Can you speak a bit about what was it like for you at the time, for that to happen? I presume it came with that accountability attached to it.
Yeah, so I think the accountability came a little later, and I'll come back to that. I think, frankly speaking, and again, this goes back to family businesses, that should have transparency and should have conversations. We didn't necessarily fully appreciate what that was worth at the time, frankly, or more importantly, what that could be worth, right? I mean, I was in high school, so I was, let's say, roughly 16 or 17 years old. My brother's 5 years younger than me. So I might have had a
Mm.
barely small understanding. My brother was 12. Like, what he understood nothing at the time, right? Of course, it's too early. And I don't think my father really necessarily understood, like, in his mind, because he was the founder and his goal, of course, was to have the kids run the business eventually and that our kids would run the business. So I don't think he was thinking about it from a pure dollars and cents valuation either. He was just thinking about next generation planning. But to your point on accountability, he did get us involved fairly early. So both my brother and I would go to the business like in our high school years over the summer, and we'd do the most, basic things to kind of help the business. It could have been working in the lab, it could have been, monitoring the warehouse, it could have been sending out some direct mailers on promoting the business. That's how we did marketing, back in the day. Could have been in some cases calling some customers. And so I think that is where the accountability really came in, was feeling a part of the business, because now, you're in it, you're living it, you're breathing it. When your father comes home and talks to you about his business trips and the sales and how the company's doing, you now understand it because you've been there working in it. So it was only at that point where it started to feel real. It wasn't necessarily the gifting of the shares. Um, but what did make it real is when that first tax bill came, right? Because now when you have that 15% equity, right, you're starting to have to pay estimated taxes and starting to pay, write checks, which of course our dad funded us with. It's not like we had our own money. But now you're writing larger checks to the IRS and you're like, oh, wait a second, like that's what 15% generates in tax. It's something meaningful. So I think
Yeah,
as
yeah.
kids, you need something real, right, to touch. Otherwise, it's difficult to fully appreciate it.
So your dad had the vision that he wanted you and hopefully, future generations to work in the family business. Uh, Did you always want to work in the family business? What are your early memories of that?
So the early memories are, I think that, I went to Northwestern University. It was always going to be to get some outside experience and see what else is out there to potentially bring it back to the family business. I mean, that was the idea. But our parents were, again, very liberal and, always said you can do whatever you want. And that was proven by the fact that my brother even spent some time in Hollywood, trying to do some acting and modeling. And so, they truly, let us do whatever we wanted to do. And so out of college, was recruited as a systems analyst at Deloitte Consulting. Got a chance to work on some e-commerce projects, which that back in the day was actually a pretty big thing. It was early on. That actually led me to go to Silicon Valley for a little while and kind of work on the dot-com, boom until it became the dot-com bust. And so we had this chance to do some different things, which I think in the end really helped us get those outside perspectives. But frankly, I really had to be pushed to be brought back into the business because once I went outside, I wasn't sure if the family business was going to be enough of a challenge for me. And this is in my young 20s, so I couldn't fully appreciate what this business could be. I thought of it as just okay, someone that's importing dyes or colorants and selling it to somebody else, but kind of a middleman. And I didn't really have the vision at that point of what else this business could be. But, you know, good or bad, the business then really started struggling. And what was happening at that point when I was in my early 20s, before I joined the family business, is that all the textile companies, so again, the companies that are making these blue jeans or dyeing towels, all took their textile business overseas. They took it to Honduras, they took it to Taiwan, China, right? If you kind of read the label on the back of your t-shirt at that time, you saw it wasn't made in the USA anymore. And so all these customers essentially started leaving this country overnight. And so we were kind of at a point where my dad said, look, we've done well enough. Your mother and I have done well enough to have a good lifestyle. But, likely if the next generation doesn't come in, like that's the end of this business. And it really wasn't a ultimatum. He was still like very open for us to do what we wanted to do. But he said, look, I still think there's opportunity in this business. You'll have to pivot, you'll have to do things, but there's still opportunity. And so ultimately, after getting a little bit of sense of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, I said, look, I want to take a shot and come back and try it because I believe in the family legacy. I saw the effort that he as an immigrant had put into generating this business, creating it. And I wanted to at least give it a shot to kind of see what I can do with it.
Very cool. And what was the transition into the family business like for you?
So this is again something that I like to share because there was no transition. Don't forget that we had a little bit of experience growing up in high school, going to the family business. So I had basic ideas, and at the time I was joining the family business. I was 23, and my brother was still in college, so it was just me joining the family
Hmm.
business. And day one, I mean, it was literally, I got a list of customers and my dad said, just call them. They will teach you everything you need to know about the business. So there was no training. There was no like, okay, shadow someone at the organization, right? That we'd see today. There was no handbook. There was no manual. There's no technical support. It was just go and learn the business. And of course, he had been in the business for so many years. So he was a resource for me. But he said the customer will teach you everything. And he was so right. He was so right because the customer would tell you, like, look, you don't have a good product, or you're too high on price, or we wish you did X, Y, Z. So it's true that while I had my dad as a mentor, everything I learned from our customers.
Hmm. Interesting. So you jumped in, and did your dad immediately step back, or were you working under your dad for a bit, or how did that look?
No, I was definitely working under my dad. He was still running the legacy business. And so I would say that the first year, what happened is I was basically a salesperson. In 2003, I was basically a salesperson, and I started traveling around the country to our various customers or ex-customer. I mean, the customers still existed, but they were like importing the finished goods from overseas. So they still existed. It's not like the customers were bankrupt, but their operations in the US basically ceased to exist. And there was a couple customers, right, that
Hmm.
were still buying a couple small things here and there. And so I started traveling to them and trying to basically understand from them, how do we grow the business? What else should we do? And the majority of them told me that you're in the wrong business. You're not going to be able to sell textile dyes in this country. And that was probably where I had the first conflict with my dad because he didn't believe that. He's like, well, you have to just go find new customers. If you work hard enough, you will find new customers for these textile dyes. Whereas I, from my first year experience, because obviously I didn't know the industry that well, my survey of the
Mm,
industry told me otherwise. And so the conflict occurred where
hmm,
I said, look, Dad, I don't agree. However, I think we can pivot into other areas. And so I started kind of getting into other areas that use colorants, but they're a different form of colorants. I won't get too technical on this podcast, but let's just say that they're different products completely, but could still utilize the benefits of our warehouse. So just in time inventory was still important and our quality assurance. We could still do testing to provide value to these customers. But the different end markets were coatings, so architectural paint, for example, as I described earlier, plastics. So you think about all consumer packaging that has color on it, a Sprite bottle, a Dasani water cap, um, Frito Lay, right? Pepsi, oh, aluminum cans. All those things have color on them. So I was like, well, where do those colors come from, right? And then eventually the same analogy for cosmetics colors and food colors. And so as I started studying these markets, what I realized is the major manufacturers were still here in the United States. They were looking for alternative suppliers that would basically give them better service. And that's the markets that I decided to pursue. And that in addition to colors, there are many other complementary products that we could add to the basket that they were interested in having the supplier for. And so as I started spending more time with these customers and then finding suppliers on the other end of the world, right, in India and China that could make these products, I then started essentially a new value added distribution business within our family business and started getting into those products that ultimately took off and did very, very well. And ultimately got us to then say, well, now we could actually manufacture some end products that the customer is looking for as well. So every decision we made for our product line and our service line was because a customer asked for it.
wow. That's a powerful story of jumping in and almost immediately realizing the road your father took you down, while it was fruitful in the past, wasn't going to bear fruit in the future, and you had to go in a new direction. Um, before I continue down that path, can you talk a little bit about that juncture, that fork in the road? I see a lot of situations where people are, commiserating about how in their family business they feel like they need to take things in a new direction, or the next generation sees a different path forward, but the existing, patriarch or matriarch sort of wants to keep things the same. Maybe they're coasting a little bit, etc. Can you speak a little bit? How did you navigate? How did you convince your dad to let you go down that new road?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. It was very tough, because don't forget, like with all due respect to him, he also knew that I didn't necessarily know what I was doing. Like, it's not like I had done this before. I mean, he had a lot of faith in me as a kind of a smart person that had done well up to date in my life. That doesn't mean that I knew, that this was going to work and all the risks involved with it. So he, definitely was, very closely watching what I was doing. And he was supportive, although like any family dynamic, like it wasn't always perfect. I mean, when I remember one of the new products I brought in, the customer that had committed to kind of buying that product from us didn't kind of take the product when they said they would. And so our cash was tied up for like 3 months. And that was a tough time, right? Because it was like, hey, like, look at this is exactly why you can't do this. And there's all a bunch of reasons why not to do it. But luckily for me, the customer eventually did honor their commitment, and then we were kind of off and running. And credit to my dad because as soon as I was able to prove myself and bring in that revenue, bring in a new customer base, and kind of show him how things were growing, and we grew pretty fast. I mean, that's when he really stepped off and stepped kind of hands off and said, "Look, just keep going," right? And then he kind of really stepped back and was very supportive. He was playing more of like a finance role where he was kind of watching like the AR, AP of the company because we didn't have an in-house CFO. And then still holding on a little bit of legacy sales because he still had some customers for some textile dyes that were in some unique applications that he was still serving. So, and he loved sales, he loved customers. So, we almost essentially, without doing it formally, we almost split the company like in two divisions. And I was doing really all the
Mm,
new, fast growing stuff, and he was kind of handling the legacy stuff.
yeah, no, that is again a very unique situation that you're able to to take things in a new direction and find success that quickly. So my hat's off to you. That's incredible. Um, your brother also joined the family business. What was his journey like? Did he go through the sort of the same trial by fire that you did, or what'd that look like?
You mean like within the family business or prior?
Sorry, I meant once he joined the family business, what roles did he play, and sort of how did he work
Yeah, I
alongside
mean,
you?
look, I would say for him also, I mean, there was a little bit of struggle because he had to come in now, and this is 3 years after I was already in, so he joined in 2006. And I'd say if the struggle for him
Mm,
initially, I think, was kinda like my dad kinda said, "Pick a team," in the sense that, "Hey, look, I'm still selling this legacy stuff, and, Akash doesn't necessarily believe in it, but I still think there's a market," you know? And I was like, "Hey, look, like, we're growing here. We want you to work on international stuff." He's fluent in Spanish, and so we wanted to do more in the Latin American market and then eventually Europe. And so I feel like he might have felt a little torn at the beginning. I mean, not like a true tug of war, but just a little bit like, "Hey, you wanna keep dad happy? He's the one who really, got us where we are, but there could be potential somewhere else." So I think he handled it very well. He's got a good balance. He made the efforts. We did it was kind of I think it was fortuitous because some of our largest legacy textile dye customers were in Mexico. And so my brother, his name is Balo really used that as kind of an opportunity to, okay, I'm going to travel to Mexico. I'm going to visit our legacy textile dye customers, but I'm also going to explore new markets for our new products, right, in Mexico and other places. So I think he handled it really well. And then, ultimately he was very successful in taking the products we had developed, the new ones, and, expanding them in Latin America and Europe. And so it was honestly a great partnership.
I've worked with my brother. It's a unique dynamic. I've worked with my father. It's a unique dynamic. Can you speak a little bit about, once you had all three of you in the business, that's not an easy balancing act, as far as keeping family separate from business. How did you manage that, that dynamic between family members?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing I would really emphasize on is just the fundamental values. So my brother and I growing up, and credit to my parents, because it's not easy sometimes, like they made us hang out all the time. We're 5 years apart. And as you can imagine, right, that's hard to do when, one kid's 15, another kid's 10, right? There's a lot of changing going on.
Yeah.
But that created such a strong foundation. We had trust, and just implicit faith in each other from the beginning. And so business was just another thing, right? Imagine brothers that don't have that kind of close relationship, or siblings, or they haven't really been together because of the reason I explained. You're going through different things at different points in your life, and you just haven't had that chance to kind of really connect on that level. And we had done everything together at that point. And so for us, I mean, of course, we had some serious discussions and we challenged each other, definitely, but the trust was implicitly there. So frankly, with my brother, it was never hard. It was never hard. We were always in it together. We always made decisions together. Now, with my father, it was a little bit difficult because look, it's another generation. I mean, he, of course, was going to be protective. He had started this thing from scratch with nobody's help. And there was times where we probably should have asked for his advice, and we didn't take, we didn't ask for his advice, and maybe he felt kind of slighted by that. Like looking back now, I can understand, why he might feel that way. But even then, again, our conflicts were short. There could have been disagreements, but there was nothing that ever got to a point that we couldn't overcome. And ultimately, we were lucky because the business performed. I mean, I think, look, if we had hit a rough patch, maybe there would have been tougher conversations. But we were fortunate. I mean, in all our years, actually, we never had a down year, which I know is unusual. But we were really hard workers. We were paranoid to a fault. We didn't take any debt on, and so we did a lot of things to kind of set us up for success. And so that, in the end of the day, the performance of the company always kind of spoke for itself.
Wow. That's incredible. You're no down years.
No.
Wow. That's gotta be a record. Um, and as far as how the business then evolved, you were growing your branch of the business, or the new branch of the business, and then your dad had sort of the legacy side. Did that trend continue until eventually the textile business completely went away, or did both branches sort of continue on into the future?
No, I mean, yeah, the textile kind of business, which we kind of call the specialty business. So some of those dyes are used, for example, to dye golf course like ponds when you go to. They look so beautiful when you go to play golf, right? Like either like the Masters, like a black color lake, or maybe a nice blue color lake, or for St. Patrick's Day, right? They dye the river green.
Yeah,
Those are
yeah.
still like those legacy dyes that he had. So there was still a market for it, although limited. And so what I'd say is, his business always kind of stayed flat, which is like around that $3 million mark when I joined. And then the newer
Mm,
business is really what kind of continued to grow. And again, it's because that's where we put all our resources. I mean, all of our kind of inventory, our new sales force, our new technical services force, they were all invested in the new product line. So I'm sure we could have still grown
mm.
the other side as well. But we just kind of we picked a horse that we thought had the most potential, and that's what we ran with.
And I understand you guys also brought you and your brother, really in or modernized the business, bringing in ERPs and other business systems and things like that. Can you speak a little bit about, I guess, what did you guys bring to the, aside from establishing this new direction, what other elements did you add ingredient wise to make the business grow?
Yeah, I mean, professionalization for sure. So as we grew, we started to hire what I would consider the right people, mostly in the sales and marketing function, as well as in the customer service and technical service areas, right? Because those are the areas that were customer facing. And as I had said at the beginning, our customers are what really drove our business, every day. As we kind of divide and conquer our responsibilities, I really focus on getting us into manufacturing in the US because we knew there was more margin potential there, quicker turnarounds from a customer standpoint, because we're not waiting for imports from overseas. And then also just more customization opportunities for customers when we started manufacturing certain colorants in the United States. And my brother's focus was very much on ERP. So, he took our company on SAP initially, and then we moved to NetSuite. But this was also where, he studied informatics, and he knew that data science was kind of going to be the future. And we started seeing that
Mm,
if we could start, even though we didn't think about selling the business at that point, we knew the business would be more valuable to us if we understood our trends, better, right? Is our business cyclical? What business are we losing? What customers haven't bought in certain period of time? That was only possible if we had excellent data analytics. And so that's
mm,
really what he put in place along with some marketing. So a lot of our brand awareness was run by him. We both went to Kellogg to do our MBAs, and Kellogg, as you may know, is very strong in marketing, and that was our takeaways from there. So he really helped create our brand images. And so what that created was, even though we were a value added distributor for most of our products, because of our branding and what our product names were, the major manufacturers were just expecting our brand name in, almost as if we were the manufacturer. And so this kind of lesson in marketing, right? Which if you think about today, you have a lot of companies, right, that they have third-party manufacturers behind the scene, and then they put some celebrity in the front of it, and then they like sell the product for lots of money because they got that brand. I mean, obviously we're not celebrities, but that's what we did with our brand. Was we really
mm.
built a lot of brand value. And again, what does that brand stand for? It stands for on-time deliveries, customer, kind of focus, quality, innovation. That's really what the brand means in the market today. And that's all stuff that we did.
Um, and then private equity came into the picture. Can you speak a little bit about that transition and what happened?
Boy, look, in a family business, that's a very, very long story, right? And so to keep it short, my brother, even though he enjoyed the business, said, look, we have all of our eggs in one basket as a family now, right? You think about next gen, whatever, it's all in this chemical business, which is now fairly sizable by now. We had, before private equity grown it from 3 million to 60 million in revenue, and, on our way to 100. And, he was like,
Wow.
maybe there's other things that I want to do that I'm passionate about. I think he also felt, and not in a bad way, that our business was every day about like sell, sell, sell. Like there was no strategy, and I think that's in the case study as well. And he's like, can I create something else on the technology side and software, some kind of consumer brand? And so he had this vision that he would like to leave the business, but he knew that that had to be planned because he was still very involved in the business, so he couldn't just step out like 3 months or 6 months later. Uh,
Hmm.
Similarly, my dad, who was still young at the time, said, "Look, I could also come up with an exit plan because at some point I got to retire." He had not really taken any money out of the business. I mean, he just kept reinvesting it for, again, as an immigrant, he didn't have like this huge lavish lifestyle or, dream or anything like that. And he was very conservative. At that point, we still didn't have any bank debt. And so it was just kind of bubbling a little bit that, look, everyone kind of, well, they both want to get out, whereas I felt the business still had a lot of potential. It's really all I knew. I mean, I was, that's what I had run as a CEO now for the last 15 years at that point. And so lots of different ways to skin the cat. I could have taken on a bunch of debt, brought my family members out, right? Could have done different things. Um, but we also wanted to make sure as a family that everyone felt like they were getting a fair value. I would never want to make an offer to my dad and my brother to buy the business, and then 10 years later they feel like, oh, he really gave us a low price, right? And so how do
Mm,
you do that? Well, then you go to market. I mean, the best way to find out what the value of the business is you go to a market and say who's willing to pay what. And so that's ultimately what we did.
yep.
We hired a rock star investment bank, and we were able to get some private equity companies to the table. And at that point, since my dad and my brother wanted out, they said, Akash, whoever you feel comfortable working with, right, we would support. And they were going to exit, each of them, fully exit their stakes in the business. And I wanted to roll as much of my share as possible because I wanted to scale the business. And I shared my vision
Uh-huh.
with these private equity folks as far as, I want to be CEO. I don't want to be micromanaged. I don't want you guys to come in and cut costs. I want to invest. And, ultimately, I believe I found a very good partner in private equity that, bought my brother and my dad out, got the family liquidity, and let me kind of continue for the next phase of the business. And that was in 2017.
That is a very well thought through process from your brother and your dad giving you time to work on their succession and to plan it, and also figuring out a solution of making sure they feel like they got a good value and giving you a capital partner to help you to keep growing. So again, I applaud you for that. Each of those things individually is difficult to achieve. So pulling it all together, that's a very well constructed plan. Um, I guess before I move on, how did you come up with that idea? Like, did you know anything about private equity? How did you figure that out?
Frankly, no, man. I didn't even know anything about valuations of companies until like 2010 when I was, a little bit outside of Kellogg. So, we were late to the game and kind of thinking about scaling and strategy. But like anything else, you just, talk to a bunch of smart people, right? And so I was in YPO, like you are, and I was able to talk to several people in the industry about, hey, what are some ideas and how I could structure this? And that's when, the smart ones recommended talking to an investment bank that understands the space, that understands the chemical industry and like why you guys are unique in what you do. And then ultimately, talking to several private equity companies. In fact, I'll be honest with you, the first few private equity companies I talked to, I wasn't that impressed with because they were generalists. And they said, look, we'll get you some
Mm,
finance, but it's up to you to run the business. And they didn't really bring strategic capital to the table as far as my kind of evaluation of them. So it took some time and effort and energy to really figure out who's going to be the right partner. And I talk about that quite a bit. I mean, selecting the right partner, like anything in life, right, is really important. And so we were really thoughtful in that process, and we really vetted out the private equity companies that came to the table. Just one more point is that, I kind of in the last stages even talked to the portfolio company CEOs of these private equity companies that own. I said, look, what's it like to work with these guys? Do they actually add value? Do they give you ideas? Or do they just like
mm.
micromanage you? Like, what are they like? And, after talking to several CEOs in the industry, is finally, when I made my decision.
If you could boil it down to sort of one or two things, what were the most advantageous elements of what they brought to the table?
So the first thing for sure was they had worked with family businesses before. I think that's such a critical understanding to have because businesses have more than just EBITDA. They have culture. They have this kind of sense of gratitude for the people that have worked for their previous generations or next generations for all these years and put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the business. And if let's just say private equity just looks at them as a number or a cost and doesn't really continue on that kind of appreciation for what they've done for the business, that's a problem for family businesses, right? I mean, you partner with private equity and the next day, like your top people are gone. That's hard to swallow. And so, that's one thing I wanted to make sure of that our people that have been there for a long time. would be mentored, be taken care of. We even gave them equity pools to give them equity in the business. So that was like paramount for me. But beyond that, also it demonstrated investment in the business so that they actually help grow the business by, again, focusing on IT, focusing on marketing. In our case, it was plant expansion. We wanted to expand our manufacturing in Savannah, Georgia. We had never had a financial department really. We had a bookkeeper, but we didn't have a CFO and a controller. And just watching like how they had done that with other companies, gave me a lot of confidence.
Mm,
So track record for sure, um, family business experience. And then of course, who are the partners that are gonna be working with you? Like some private equity companies, which have happened to me, is they come in and they say, hey, this is the person that's gonna be working with you. And then they bait and switch and some other guy shows up the first day and they're like, who's this guy? This is not who we talked with. So, you want to know who you're gonna work with. So
absolutely. And then so since then, you grew the business with that private equity partner, and you've since sold the business completely.
yeah, so it's the definition of completely is interesting. So what happened is, as we started getting closer to private equity companies, they tell you from day one that look, we're going to hold this company from 3 to 7 years. I mean, we have to eventually return money to our investors. That's how private equity works. And so when we partnered in 2017, it was fully with the understanding that there's going to be another sale in the next 3 to 7 years, right? And so as we
Mhm.
started getting closer to that kind of time horizon, about 4 years in, 3.5 years in, I've reflected on, do I really want to be CEO in the future? Do I want to be around for another 5 to 7 years? The next private equity company comes in, or and my kids were getting older and I wanted to spend more time with them. And I had really worked really hard for 19 years at that point, traveling around the world, not a whole lot of work family balance. And I thought, hey, maybe it's time for me to step back and bring on another CEO. So at least I had the option to leave if I want to. And so that's exactly what we did. We brought in a CEO from the industry, that kind of trained alongside me for some period of time. And then I kind of just went away into the sunset, like as the board member, and I was still available as needed. And then we decided with the private equity group that it was time to sell the business. And this was in December of 21. And we were very fortunate because that was a very good time in the history of markets and
Yeah.
multiples and all that stuff. So it was a great time. So we got a great offer, a great group, all that, and it was something we couldn't refuse. And so we agreed to sell. And like this is one of those things you will learn in business, like always, like like a last minute thing that's like 5 days before closing. The company comes and says, "Oh, Akash, you can't sell all your shares. We need you to continue along this business." And I said, "Well, I'm not part of the deal. I mean, I've already stepped down as CEO. What do you mean?" And long story short, they said, "Look, we want you to roll 5% of the company. We want you to stay on the board. We want to kind of benefit from the expertise you have in the industry." And so I do still have about 5% of the company. I'm still on the board. It's not a bad deal. I mean, I can still kind of, watch the company and help where I can. And there'll be a third exit at some point. So, it worked out well. But that last part wasn't planned.
Yeah, yeah. No, we do a lot of deals on the where we are the buyer, and I understand why they did that because when you see, the founder or one of the key family members who's been leading the business, they're so vital to that continuity. So it makes a lot of sense. Um, and we're getting close to the end here. So two last questions. The first one is, so what's next? What are you doing now?
So, I couple different things. I mean, having a family business for some, right, is that idea of legacy. And so in my mind, I always felt a little guilty that now my kids don't have this business that their grandfather started, right? We don't have that anymore. And what should be done about that? And so I struggled a little bit on that point because, of course, I had a business that I could walk into. And so, do I start a new business and then eventually they'll take it over, right? Do I not even worry about that because they will have great education and they're capable, they'll take care of themselves? Um, or ultimately, what I chose to do is create a family office, which essentially is going to take the proceeds of what we earned from our previous business and make investments, diversified investments in other businesses. And so for now, we have a holding company called 2.0 Ventures, and 2.0 Ventures has made since 2017, several investments in other industries, real estate, manufacturing, crypto and blockchain, right, et cetera, et cetera. And so, hoping to continue to kind of spread that out and look at investments both for the medium and long term for that family office. And, the hope is that the kids will want to be involved in some way in that. Now, whether they run the family office, whether they are just board members, right? It's a little too early for that, but that kind of at least checks the box for me, that they'll have something to kind of spring off of, kind of a next generation thing. But at the same time, I'm also looking at operating companies that I can be on certain boards of or co-invest with as well. So it's a little bit up in the air, frankly. And then the last thing that I'm doing is doing some guest speaking at business schools. So I do some guest speaking at both Kellogg School of Management, where I went, as well as Columbia Business School, which is the case study that you referenced earlier.
Very cool. And it's awesome that you're trying to find a balance of how do you create that opportunity for your kids, that you had with your father, but also, how do you still find stuff for yourself to do, like, being involved in operating companies, et cetera. Um, I guess my last question would be, what do you hope the identity of your family legacy is going forward? We have also sold that original operating company, and it was a big moment for us because our identity was so tied up in it. And then you're left with this kind of moment afterwards of like, okay, who are we now? You know, what's your hope as far as what your family business legacy is, in another one or two generations going forward?
So one of the things we've already set up is kind of a philanthropic organization. So we already have our own donor advised fund and our own, kind of our charitable organization where we do give back quite a bit. And frankly, that's kind of number one, like for the kids to continue that and to truly understand that, philanthropy is a way of helping others, supporting others. That would be the objective of any further wealth creation, is to continue to think about philanthropy, but also going back to like the values of, frankly, immigrant parents, right? I mean, we did well in the industry because I think we were the most hardworking people in our industry for a long period of time. And so going forward, next generations, have to continue that. They have to be hardworking. They have to work for others. They have to support hardworking people, right? They have to help lift other people up that are kind of in need of help. And so be great mentors, be kind people. So for us, it's really about that. I mean, at the end of the day, wealth is just a number. You can only spend so much money and do so many things in your life. It's really about the people you influence and how you, act with others. And that's what we instill with our kids. And that's all that's important, honestly. Everything else will take care of itself.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Fun discussion. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm Luke Hanson McDonald. This is Beyond the Family Business Podcast. Take care.